200 men. And not one of them made a sound. Not the lifers in the back corner. Not the guards gripping their radios on the elevated walkway. Not even the man who, just 30 seconds ago, thought he ran everything inside these walls. They all just watched. Because what happened in that prison cafeteria on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in 1993 wasn't just a fight. It wasn't a brawl. It wasn't a man losing his temper. It was 2 seconds, 2 punches, that dismantled an empire that had taken years to build. And the man who did it wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He had eaten lunch at the same table for months without causing a single problem. He just wanted to be left alone. His name was Mike Tyson. He was 26 years old. And what he did that afternoon, and more importantly, how he did it, is one of the most striking examples of controlled power you will ever hear about. Stay with me. Because this story isn't really about violence. It's about something much more rare. To understand what happened in that cafeteria, you need to understand who Mike Tyson was when he arrived at the Indiana Youth Center, now known as Plainfield Correctional Facility, in April of 1992. He wasn't the legend yet. Not the icon. Not the post-prison comeback story who would fill arenas again. He was a 25-year-old man who had just been convicted of rape, sentenced to 6 years, and stripped, overnight, of every single thing that had defined him. The championship belts. The crowd. The money. The fear that 40 opponents had felt walking into a ring against him. All of it gone. Replaced by a 6-by-9-foot cell, a bunk bed, and the constant noise of 1,600 other men doing hard time. Here's something people don't talk about enough. In prison, being famous isn't protection. It's a target. Tyson himself said in interviews that guys tested him from the moment he walked in. Every man with something to prove wanted to be the one who stepped to Iron Mike and didn't back down. His 41-1 professional record meant nothing inside those walls. Actually, it made things worse. Because now there were guys who wanted to be the ones who said they stood up to the most feared boxer on the planet. So Tyson made a calculated decision. One that showed more maturity than most people give him credit for at that stage of his life. He kept his head down. He trained in the makeshift gym. He studied. He read philosophy, Nietzsche, Machiavelli, and he converted to Islam. He sat at the same table, with the same small group of quiet inmates, and he moved through each day without engaging in the politics that swallowed most men alive in that place. For months it worked. And then a man named Tony stepped into his cafeteria. Every prison has a structure. An unofficial hierarchy that operates beneath the surface, below the guards, below the rules, below everything visible. Inmates know it. Guards know it. Even the administration, on some level, tolerates it, because a facility with an organized hierarchy is easier to manage than one in pure chaos. At Plainfield in 1993, one man sat at the top of that structure. Let's call him Tony, a composite of the kind of figure Tyson and other former inmates have described existing in that environment. A lifer. Over a decade in the system. A man who controlled contraband, ran protection arrangements, and settled disputes, not out of generosity, but because control was currency. And Tony had built himself a fortune of it. He was physically imposing. He had the loyalty, or at least the obedience, of a crew. And every new significant arrival at Plainfield eventually had a meeting with him. Not a confrontation. A conversation. An offer. You work with me. Or you become a problem I solve. Most men took the first option. The few who didn't usually ended up in the infirmary within the week. Quietly, in a way no one could trace back to Tony, and when they recovered, they reconsidered his offer. That system had worked without fail for years. Until Tony looked across the cafeteria one afternoon, saw Mike Tyson eating mashed potatoes alone at a corner table, and made the single worst decision of his prison career. He walked over. His crew fanned out behind him. The 2 other guys at Mike's table stood up and moved away without a word. That's how well everyone understood what Tony's approach meant. Tyson, Tony said. We need to talk. And what followed was a conversation that, at first, looked like every other conversation Tony had ever had in that facility. He laid it out simply. Everyone in this place works with me or works for me. You're Mike Tyson. You've got a name. You've got respect. That makes you valuable. So choose. Mike set down his fork. Looked up calmly. I don't work for anyone. Now, pause here for a second, because this moment matters. Tony had walked across that cafeteria expecting one of two responses: submission or visible aggression. Submission he could use. Aggression he could punish publicly and make an example of. What he did not expect was complete calm. Mike Tyson, a man Tony knew by reputation as explosive and dangerous, just looked at him with steady eyes and said no. Not angrily. Not with bravado. The way a man says no when the answer is simply, factually, no. That calm unnerved Tony more than shouting would have. So he pushed. You don't understand. I run this place. Everything that happens here happens because I allow it. Mike looked at him for a moment. And then he said two words. Not anymore. 2 words. And the entire cafeteria changed temperature. 200 men heard it. Guards heard it. Tony's crew heard it. And Tony heard it loudest of all, because he understood exactly what those 2 words meant in the context of that room, in front of that audience. They meant his authority was being publicly rejected. Not privately. Not in a conversation he could walk away from and spin later. Right here, with every man in that facility watching. Tony's face went red. He told everyone to mind their own business. But nobody looked away, they just pretended to. He lowered his voice. Stepped closer. Got angrier. Mike, for his part, picked up his tray and stood to leave. He'd said what he had to say. He had no desire to escalate this further. Here's what I want you to notice. Mike tried to walk away. Twice. That detail matters enormously. Because the story of what happened next is often told as a story about Mike Tyson's power. But it's really a story about Mike Tyson's restraint. He could have exploded the moment Tony showed up at his table. He could have made it about pride, about reputation, about sending a message. Instead, he tried to eat his lunch. He made his position clear with as few words as possible. And when things got tense, he picked up his tray to go. Tony didn't let him. He stepped directly into Mike's path. And then, in front of 200 witnesses, he shoved Mike in the shoulder. Hard. You're not going anywhere, Tony said loudly. Not until you understand that I own this place. And that means I own you. Mike stopped. He turned around slowly. He looked at Tony the way a man looks at something he's already made peace with. And when Tony shoved him a second time and said, "Make me," Mike set his tray down on the nearest table. Carefully. Deliberately. And he turned around and raised his hands, not wildly, not angrily. In the clean, technical stance of a man who has spent more hours in a boxing gym than most people spend doing anything in their lives. Tony threw first. A wide, looping right hand. The kind of punch that works in bar fights, in prison brawls, against opponents who don't know what they're doing. Mike slipped it. Barely moved his head. A millimeter of distance that only exists if you've trained thousands of hours to create it. And then he countered. 1. A short, precise body shot to the solar plexus. The kind of punch that doesn't look devastating until the air leaves a person's body all at once and they realize they can't breathe. 2. A compact hook to the jaw, delivered in the moment Tony's forward momentum was still carrying him forward. 2 punches. 2 seconds. Tony's knees buckled. His eyes went glassy. His crew members caught him before he hit the ground, but they barely managed it. He was deadweight, conscious but unable to speak, gasping in the arms of the men who had spent years watching him terrify everyone around him. And for a long moment, nobody moved. Before we get to what happened next, and what this moment meant not just for Mike, but for everyone in that facility, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Mike Tyson had any other choice in that situation? Or was there another way this could have gone? I read every comment on this channel. Genuinely. And I want to hear what you think. Hit that comment section. Now, back to Plainfield. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then, from somewhere near the back of the cafeteria, someone started clapping. Slow. Deliberate. And then another person joined in. And another. until half the room was applauding, not for the violence, but for what the violence represented. Years of fear. Suddenly, visibly, exposed. Mike picked up his tray and walked back to his table. He sat down. He started eating. Like nothing had happened. The guards swept in, radios crackling. They took statements. And here's the thing, every account they received said the same thing. Tony had been the aggressor. He had blocked Mike's exit. He had made physical contact first, twice. Mike had only responded when he had no other option. No serious disciplinary action came to Mike. In prison terms, it was as clean a case of self-defense as you'll ever document. Tony spent several days in the infirmary. Not because Mike had hurt him severely, and this is important, he hadn't. 2 precisely placed punches, and he'd stopped the threat. No permanent injury. Just enough force to end a confrontation that had been forced on him. That restraint, combined with the clarity of the self-defense circumstances, was something the guards quietly respected. Tony had been a thorn in their side for years. A managed problem. Now that problem had a crack in it. And cracks spread. Within days, Tony's network started unraveling. Inmates who had obeyed out of fear began quietly ignoring his orders. Rival groups moved into spaces he'd controlled. The contraband trade he had curated started going around him instead of through him. Within a month, Tony was requesting protective custody, because the men he had once dominated were no longer afraid of him. And in that environment, fear was the only thing his authority had ever truly rested on. Mike, meanwhile, found something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not the uneasy peace of staying invisible. A different kind. The kind that comes when people understand where your limits are, and understand that those limits exist. Inmates gave him space. Genuine space. They didn't crowd him or try to use his name or push him into anything. Even the guards noticed that the cafeteria was calmer, the yard less tense, the facility generally easier to manage in the months that followed. A fellow inmate told Mike directly, "You changed this whole place." Mike shook his head. "I just wanted to eat my lunch." And that response, probably more than the fight itself, is what I think defines this story. People hear this story and they focus on Mike Tyson's power. They focus on the punches. They focus on the moment. But I think the far more interesting story is everything that didn't happen. Mike Tyson could have been volatile from his first week in that facility. He could have walked in trying to establish himself. He could have looked for the hierarchy and decided to climb it. He had every tool to do so. Instead, he made a deliberate choice to just not. To eat lunch quietly. To train. To read. To survive. And when confrontation arrived anyway, he didn't meet it halfway. He stated his position without aggression. He walked away, twice, before he responded. And when he finally did respond, he used the minimum force necessary to end the threat and nothing more. That is not just discipline. That is a level of self-awareness that most people, especially people under that kind of pressure, never develop. Tony ruled through fear. And Tony's greatest mistake wasn't approaching Mike Tyson. It was believing that power built on fear is permanent. Because it isn't. Fear only works until the moment someone decides they're not afraid anymore. That's its entire architecture. The second one person stands in front of you and says, "Not anymore," and means it, the whole structure begins to collapse. Because all the other people who were afraid start looking at each other and realizing, if he's not afraid, why am I? Real power, durable power, works differently. It's built on something people choose to give rather than something forced out of them. And that's a truth that applies just as much outside those prison walls as inside them. In boardrooms. In families. In any relationship where one person has tried to use dominance instead of trust. Mike Tyson served the rest of his sentence, released in March 1995 after 3 years, without serious incident. He came out leaner in some ways, more self-aware in others. He'd read Machiavelli and Nietzsche. He'd converted to Islam. He'd had 3 years to sit with himself without the noise of the world's biggest boxing career surrounding him. Whatever you think of the circumstances that brought him there, And those circumstances are complicated and deserve their own honest conversation. What Mike Tyson did with the time he had to serve is worth understanding. That's the story. 2 punches in 2 seconds that changed the power structure of an entire correctional facility. But behind those 2 seconds were months of restraint, discipline, and a man who understood exactly who he was, and refused to become someone else under pressure. If you made it this far, I want to know what you took from this. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Seriously, what part of this story hit different for you? And if you found value in this video, there's a simple thing you can do that costs you nothing but genuinely helps this channel. Hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube this story is worth sharing with more people, and that means we get to keep making them. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Real moments, real people, real lessons. No fluff. No file. Just stories worth your time. I'll see you in the next one.